I'd like to introduce Dr. Arye Janoff from the U.S. Corps of Engineers. He is an earth and environmental scientist with a specialization in coastal geo-morphology, economics, and maritime transportation. Since 2022, with the Army Corps San Francisco district, he's worked in plan formation and on regional dredged material management, navigation, beneficial use of dredged material, put a pin in that, and engineering with nature projects. He also is an SF Bay long-term management strategy program manager and the lead planner on the regional dredged material management plan. And then lastly, he also serves as an action officer, which is a fantastic title, on the Army Corps Infrastructure Assessment Planning and Response Team, which supports the Corps' emergency management mission and FEMA's disaster response and recovery efforts, which have gotten used a fair amount in past years. So take it over, Dr. Janoff. And feel free to grab the screen.
Thanks very much, Dennis. And thank you to our hosts and sponsors for inviting us here. I'm Arye Janoff. As Dennis mentioned, I'm with the Army Corps of Engineers. I'm sort of looking up because I have got it in a conference room right now, and I'm going to share my screen and start my presentation up here. Okay, so now you're some Zoom inception, and now I'm going to start the presentation. So as Dennis mentioned, I'm Arye Janoff. I'm a senior project planner with the Army Corps of Engineers San Francisco District. And I'm going to talk to you all today about what we're doing here in San Francisco Bay to try to maximize all the dredged material that we use for beneficial purposes. So the Army Corps of Engineers is a federal agency that has many different what we call business lines or mission areas in Army speak. These include navigation, which is dredging navigation channels in order to support international commerce via the maritime waterways. This is essentially maintaining underwater highways for those big cargo vessels that we see going in and out of San Francisco Bay, under the Golden Gate Bridge into the various ports and harbors that we have here in the Bay. We also, in addition to navigation, we do ecosystem restoration, which is self-explanatory. It's restoring ecosystems to what their habitats looked like prior to human intervention or in some form of hybrid restoration environment. We also do coastal storm risk management, which means we protect coastal communities against storm surge, coastal erosion due to wave action, extreme weather events that result in bluff retreat and cliff retreat due to atmospheric rivers. We also have flood risk management as a mission area, which is adapting to rising waters. And that's the combination of, that could be, high water events, king tides, sea level rise, etc. And on the right-hand side, we have a graphic that shows what our San Francisco district's boundaries are. So there are many different districts across the nation within the Corps of Engineers. The San Francisco district covers the Klamath River in southern Oregon and around the Oregon border along the coast, all the way down to about Big Sur and the San Luis Obispo area. And as you can see, we're a very coastal focused district. We're really that narrow strip, the light blue here on the western side of California. And so navigation, being in San Francisco Bay, in addition, we have Humboldt Bay as part of our district's area of responsibility, we call it. But San Francisco Bay is really the main conduit for all goods coming into the United States between the Pacific Northwest ports like in Portland and Seattle, and the Southern California ports like Port of Hueneme, ports of LA and Long Beach. We're really the major harbor of safe refuge for all of these large cargo vessels to come in. And we have one of the larger ports in the United States, the Port of Oakland, that handles most of our containerized cargo. So those are those big Lego looking blocks that come in on those container vessels. And so the navigation mission in the Bay Area accounts for about 68 billion annually for the maritime industry. And the purpose, as I had mentioned, is to maintain navigable waterways, safe, reliable, efficient, environmentally sustainable waterborne transportation. And our channels go as far into the San Francisco Bay Delta, so that services like the ports of Sacramento and Stockton, as well as going up the Northern California coast. As I had mentioned, Humboldt is a big port up there as well. And the purpose of the navigation mission is to achieve our full channel depth that we're authorized to dredge to. And again, this is kind of like maintaining a highway. So, we dredge the sediment, and then the sediment shoals into that channel, or it deposits in that channel, and it makes that channel shallower over time. And so we have to periodically go and dig that sediment out in order to keep it at the depth that's required for any of the vessels that are calling on the various ports around our bay. But we do this, we have to be fully compliant with federal environmental regulations and laws. And, so there's a big focus on protecting species and ecosystems as part of our navigation mission. It's a requirement. And more recently, there's been a big push, both external to the Corps, but also internally, there's been a lot of agency policy that's changed that's really focused on trying to maximize the beneficial use of our dredged material. So rather than treating the sediment as just a pollutant that needs to be removed from a place, i.e. the channel, we're actually seeing it as a resource that can be used for good, especially as it relates to adapting to climate change. And just a quick note, in recent years, I'm going to cover this in just a bit, but in recent years, we've actually been able to achieve about 80% beneficial use of dredged material for wetland enhancement and restoration and shoreline improvements here in San Francisco Bay. So our dredging footprint here in the Bay, we have our various federal navigation channels in red here. Some of these black polygons are also federal navigation channels, but they're less frequently dredged or not really dredged all that much. So this equates to approximately 5,700 acres of spatial coverage and about 2% of the bay's surface area. So it's not insignificant, but it's a pretty small amount of the actual surface area of the bay that we're dredging. And just to give you a sense of scale, I know people probably don't think about sediment and millions of cubic yards of sediment all that much. And frankly, I don't exactly know what 1.5 million to 2 million cubic yards would look like. I should probably have that on hand to know how many rooms it would fill or school buses or something. But that's the volume of sediment that we dredge, about 1.5 million to 2 million cubic yards per year here in San Francisco Bay. Compared to other parts of the country, that's really actually not a ton of sediment. Like the Mississippi River is tens of millions of cubic yards, or maybe even pushing 100 million, I'm not sure. The East Coast dredges a lot, but here on the West Coast, relative to other places that are dredged on the West Coast, this is a pretty large volume. So we do a lot of dredging in the bay, is the point. And as I had mentioned, we have to do it in environmentally sustainable ways. So we have permitted placement sites where we can put the sediment. That could be aquatic, so that could be in San Francisco Bay at permitted sites, or in the near shore just outside of the Golden Gate. It could be the deep ocean, which is 55 or 60 miles offshore. It's west of the Farallones, and that's in really deep water, 10,000 feet deep. So this is effectively disposal of the sediment. This is like what we would be doing if we treat the sediment as a pollutant and we're just trying to get it out of the system. Or we could also place the sediment onshore. And this could be in the form of a transfer site where we place the sediment in a confined location that it's then rehandled. So it's picked up again and taken somewhere else. Or more likely, it's placed at a site for wetland restoration, such as Cullinan Ranch or Montezuma up in San Pablo and Sassoon Bays, respectively. And those are for, those are like former ranch lands that have been converted to marsh more recently, because historically they were marsh as well. That could also be beach nourishment projects, like placing sand directly on the beach. So we did that recently at the south end of Ocean Beach, and I know that the city wants to do more of that, but that could be elsewhere too. So broadly, beneficial use is, it's kind of self-explanatory. It's trying to apply that dredged material to the landscape in order to create either social or environmental benefits. It could be ecological benefits, could be restoring habitat, enhancing public access and recreation, nourishing beaches, as I had mentioned, adapting to sea level rise. There are various other types of beneficial use too, even commercial aggregate for cement. But we really focus on these more environmental and social themes for beneficial use. And this is what it looks like to do beach nourishment, actually pumping the sand onto the beach. And this is what a restored wetland looks like. This is Montezuma Wetlands, the project up in Sassoon Bay. So how it's done is that we dredge the material from the channel that's on the left here in this schematic, and then we put it into a scow or a barge. We tug it across the bay. We take it to a location where there's what's called an offloading facility that has a piece of machinery that pumps water into the barge in order to slurry it. So in order to move the sediment, they have to essentially fluidize it. It's like putting it into a straw. And then it's pumped across a pipe onto wherever the location is that they're trying to restore in order to raise the ground surface elevation to a target elevation for marsh plain. And in the last 2 years, for the past, I would say 3 decades, we've been able to do a few different beneficial use projects. The biggest one that people might know about is Hamilton Wetlands, or it used to be Hamilton Airfield. And in recent years, though, we have gotten a big slug of money via a pilot program to do this beneficial use, because the beneficial use is more expensive than taking material and placing it in the bay or taking it to the deep ocean. And so we need additional funds in order to take that sediment to places like Montezuma or Cullinan, or in the future Belmarine Keys, or any other beneficial use location that's looking to restore habitat. So we were able to, via this pilot program, accomplish about 3.1 million cubic yards of dredged material going to beneficial use. And that cost the federal government about, a little over $18 million. The pilot program it was approved for a larger sum, I think up to in the 50 millions. So we're continuing to ask for more money in order to do more of this beneficial use. But this is just an early indication of how successful the pilot program has been. And it's taken, sediment from some of our larger channels in Central Bay, like Oakland and Richmond. And these locations I have outlined here are where the sediment has gone so far. That's not to say that it can't be delivered somewhere in South Bay in the future, should there be a beneficial use wetland restoration opportunity that presents itself. So in addition to directly placing in a subsided area, so where the ground surface elevation needs to be raised to a marsh plain, we can also support existing marshes with a boost of sediment. And this is what we would call engineering with nature. It's leveraging natural processes. So the top column here, we have what's called marsh spraying, which is taking sediment from a navigation channel and piping it over potentially a levee. There are often levees, down in South Bay from the former salt ponds, and taking it to an existing marsh and then spraying it to create a layer that would allow the marsh to vertically keep pace with sea level rise. So it's providing, it's an injection of sediment to an existing marsh plain, and that allows the marsh plants to actually grow up through that dredged material and continue building on itself, which is its natural process. We also have an approach called water column seeding, which is taking advantage of tidal flow and transporting that sediment by piping the material to the mouth of the tidal marsh and to the mouth of a tidal channel as the tide is flooding in, so as the tide is rising, and that moves the sediment into the channels, and then when the tide slacks, that sediment can then deposit, and that similarly helps the marsh, to keep pace with sea level rise. And then the other type of placement that we can do is a shallow water placement. So instead of piping the material to the marsh, we place the material in the nearshore zone. For safety reasons, you'd have to go to the subtidal, or like below where the low tide would reach, the low tide line, because we need to get the equipment in there. And you would place that sediment there in a mound that would then erode based on wave energy in the bay, or if it's in the open ocean, it could, wave energy from the ocean. wind and wave as well as tide would help to move that sediment from that subtidal location where we place the sediment and up onto the mudflat and ultimately onto the marsh. And I'm spending the most time on this one because this is the one that we actually piloted in December of 2023 as part of that pilot program. And we did it out of the Port of Redwood City. And I'll show some pictures in just a slide here. So we did 90,000 cubic yards of dredged material from two of the reaches. A channel, a federal navigation channel, is broken up into components, and those are called reaches. So this was a smaller scale project because it's a pilot project. The channel actually produces like in the hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of dredged material. But this was really a proof of concept. We wanted to see, can we do this? Can we deliver the sediment to the location that we want to deliver it? And does the sediment go where we think it goes? So we dredged the material from the channel. And this is a picture of them actually dredging Redwood City last December, right about a year ago. Started on December 6th. And then it was loaded into these barges and taken across the bay. And this is an image of them actually doing that. It was tugged across the bay to the nearshore placement location. And then it was deposited. And that sediment, we are using a tracer study, magnetically coated particles that we deployed alongside USGS. This is part of a broader monitoring strategy and monitoring plan. So we're working with USGS to do biological monitoring, physical monitoring, and we're also doing this tracer study. But I'm highlighting this because this is kind of the easiest way to see where the sediment went. So the tracer was deployed, and it's this coated with magnetic particles. And then there are magnets that are deployed in concentric rings around the placement site. And we're able to determine whether the sediment went in the direction that we thought it was going. So in this case, the placement site, which is this polygon here, this kind of elongated shape, we placed it there, and then the goal was to try to get the sediment to move toward Eden Landing Ecological Reserve. More specifically, it's called Whale's Tail Marsh. I'm sure many of you know about it. And the exciting thing, we have early results. So it was deployed in January of 2024, and we are still processing the results of all of our different monitoring plans. But the particle tracing team was actually able to detect that sediment did in fact make it into the marsh. So we weren't even sure that 90,000 cubic yards of sediment, which is not a whole lot of sediment, would make it that far. We kind of thought that if we can see it going toward the mudflat even, that's success because it's helping to attenuate waves and helping to reduce erosion on the marsh edge. But in this case, we actually found sediment in the marsh starting as early as February of this year and going all the way through to June. So that's very exciting news and an early indication of success of this proof of concept, which means that we're hoping to be able to try this again in either a different part of the bay or scale up in magnitude of how much sediment we place there. So now zooming back out to the bay, I'm going to talk about really briefly a policy mechanism that we're trying to tweak in order to increase our beneficial use of dredged material as part of our standard operating procedure. So a regional dredged material management plan is the operational plan for how we dredge the channels and where we place the material from, in this case, in San Francisco Bay, it's for the 9 federal channels in the bay. And we are required by Congress and by Army Corps of Engineers policy to identify that operational plan that is the least cost, environmentally acceptable, and technically feasible. What does that mean? Least cost is pretty clear. It's economics driven. Environmentally acceptable means that it complies with federal environmental laws and regulations. Technically feasible means we can do it from an engineering standpoint, right? We have the equipment to do it. We can safely navigate to that location, and we can place there. And so those 3 components are together called the federal standard. And I'm pointing this out, and not to get too into policy, but because the federal standard has in the past been a constraint on beneficial use, specifically as it relates to cost, because beneficial use is more expensive than placing it at different locations in the bay. So historically, we have not, as part of the federal standard, or like where we place the material year over year, that's 100% federally funded. that material has not been able to go to beneficial use. But what we're trying to do in this regional dredge material management plan is really use a regional approach to identify, can we find cost savings in certain channels that would be able to lower the cost for the region, and that cost savings could then be applied to the channels that make sense to take the material to beneficial use. And in doing so, we would be able to achieve cost parity, so we keep it the same cost as what the federal standard was of the past, but we're able to actually increase beneficial use that is paid for 100% by the federal government. So this is kind of a new approach, and it's very exciting to try to move the needle toward more beneficial use. And anything above the federal standard can still be done. We just need non-federal partners to help us share in that cost, and that's historically what's happened. We've had to have the state or other non-federal entities, nonprofits, for instance, share in that cost to do beneficial use. So zooming into South Bay, we have identified as part of this process, we have the Redwood City Channel, which is the sediment source. And then as part of the process, we've identified several potential beneficial use opportunities. And of course, we're open to any other ideas that folks might bring to the table. So that includes our whale's tail strategic placement, potentially, doing this at a larger scale, or maybe even expanding the area, or maybe in a slightly different location. That could also mean direct placement of sediment on subsided baylands, such as the Southern Eden Landing Ecological Reserve, or the Alviso Ponds Complex, and that's part of the South Bay Salt Ponds. And that's to raise the marsh plain elevation, like I was talking about, like we've done at Cullinan Ranch, Hamilton, and Montezuma up in the North Bay. There are other engineering with nature approaches that we could try to pilot, and that could be water column seeding. That was the delivery of sediment to the mouth of tidal channels that I had mentioned. That could be, at Ravenswood or Faber Tract or Knapp Tract. So we're really trying to expand our thinking here and trying to find ways to put the sediment to use in the best way possible. So how do you engage in the process? Well, if you know of a wetland, beach, coastline that needs protection in your community, and there is a permitted project, and is ready to receive sediment, we can deliver the sediment to you, so long as it matches in terms of like the grain size and the sediment quantity, so like the volume of sediment. But in order to do this, we really need early and often coordination. And we have a recent policy update where we are able to update our DMMP, our Dredge Material Management Plan, every single year with any new sites that come online. It just requires us to map it out in advance, figure out the cost, and then if it's least cost, then it could potentially be 100% federal. But if it's not least cost, then we would have to identify a non-federal group that would be willing to fund at least a portion of that beneficial use. And the exciting thing is that the non-federal partner does not have to take on 100% of the cost. We also have a recent authority that allows us to cost share. Federal government, the Army Corps of Engineers, would pay 65% of the additional cost above that federal standard to deliver the material to the beneficial use location, and the non-federal partner would pay 35%. So very exciting times, and we're really trying to just do as much beneficial use as possible, throw as much spaghetti on the wall and see what sticks. And please email us at the email below, or go to our website for the regional DMMP to learn more about our project and engage. And I'm happy to share my email as well. And with that, I will step back if there are any questions. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Janoff. I agree. This is the more we learn about what's going on in the Bay, the more exciting the prospect is. We hear often about the wetlands from kind of the wetlands out to the Bay. So I mean, it's an interesting view the other way. The other thing that's interesting is that since a lot of the navigational dredging is repeated in kind of the usual areas, that the relative cleanliness of the material is better. I mean, you're I'm sure at one point, so many years ago, it was full of a lot of nasty stuff. And but it seems like that, that has improved over time. And then, the materials, which I've been calling sludge. I notice you did not use the S word at all, but and I only thought of that when you started saying about what sticks to the wall. I'm sure this dredge material would stick to any wall.
Yeah.
But uh, um, yeah, so anyway, I don't see any specific questions. I think the audience was so awed by the presentation that and everything was covered in this area, but it is something I know that we will follow. And as a matter of fact, in terms of following, we have Jackie Zipkin coming up from EBDA and talking about a perspective from the shoreline out. It's no coincidence that she's following you up.